Broadhaven Primary School sat quietly on the Welsh coastline, surrounded by open fields, low hills, and the steady sound of the nearby sea. In February 1977, nothing about the village suggested it would become part of a national mystery. It was a small rural community where days followed predictable routines and unusual events were rare. That morning, classes moved forward as normal, and children were released into the playground during break time with no indication that anything out of the ordinary was about to occur. The playground was open and exposed, bordered by grass and fencing rather than tall buildings. Visibility was clear, and there were no distractions in the sky that would normally draw attention. It was during this ordinary moment that several children noticed something they could not immediately identify. Their attention shifted upward and outward toward the area beyond the school grounds, where an object appeared without warning. The children later described the object as metallic and smooth, reflecting light rather than producing it. It did not move like an aircraft they recognized, and it made no sound as it appeared to hover near the school. There were no wings, no visible exhaust, and no rotation. The object did not rush past or fade quickly. Instead, it remained visible long enough for multiple children to observe it carefully. As more children noticed the object, they began pointing it out to one another. Their reactions were not chaotic. Teachers later reported that the children did not scream or panic. They appeared confused and curious, trying to understand what they were seeing rather than reacting with fear. This detail would later become important during official questioning. The object's position relative to the school made the sighting difficult to dismiss. It was not distant or high in the clouds. According to the children, it appeared close enough for them to notice shape, surface, and movement. Some estimated it was near the edge of the school grounds, while others described it as hovering slightly beyond the fence line. Within moments, the children began moving back toward the school building, attempting to alert adults to what they had seen. At this point, the object was no longer visible. Whether it moved away or vanished was unclear, but its absence was immediate. What remained was a shared experience among multiple witnesses, all describing the same basic details. The event would not be dismissed later by authorities. As the children gathered inside the school building, they began describing what they had seen in small groups rather than all at once. Their accounts were given calmly, without signs of exaggeration or distress. Teachers noticed that the descriptions were consistent in basic details, even though the children spoke independently. Each description focused on the object's shape, its silence, and how close it appeared to be to the school. The object was described as elongated rather than round, with a smooth silver surface that reflected daylight. Several children compared it to a cigar shape, while others avoided comparisons and simply described it as long and metallic. None of the children mentioned wings, windows, or markings. No child described smoke, sound, or movement associated with engines. This absence of familiar aircraft features stood out during later interviews. Some of the children reported that the object appeared to be stationary for a brief period. Others said it moved slowly, without changing altitude or direction abruptly. Despite slight differences in wording, the overall impression remained the same. The object did not behave like an airplane or helicopter known to the children. A smaller number of children added another detail that would later become controversial. They stated that they noticed a figure near the object. This figure was described as human-like in shape, but dressed in a reflective or silver-colored suit. The head appeared covered, similar to a helmet, and no facial features were clearly visible. Importantly, not every child reported seeing this figure, and those who did not elaborate beyond basic observations. Teachers noted this difference carefully. They did not push the children for more details, and no attempt was made to guide or correct their statements. Each account was recorded as it was given. The lack of pressure during these early moments would later be cited as important when evaluating the credibility of the testimony. At this stage, no adults had witnessed the object themselves. The sighting existed entirely through the children's reports. This raised immediate doubts among school staff, who initially considered the possibility of imagination or misunderstanding. However, the number of witnesses and the consistency of the core description made it difficult to dismiss quickly. The school environment returned to routine, but the incident remained a topic of quiet discussion among staff. Teachers compared notes and observed the children closely for signs of excitement or fabrication. None were observed. Lessons continued, yet the sense that something unusual had occurred lingered. By the end of the school day, the decision was made to formally report the incident. The school administration concluded that the situation required external review, not because a conclusion had been reached, but because the event could not be reasonably explained within the school alone. When the incident was reported outside the school, attention shifted from internal discussion to formal review. Local authorities were notified, and the information was passed on without interpretation or assumptions. The focus was placed on recording what had been observed rather than explaining it. This approach would later influence how the case was handled. Local police officers arrived at the school to speak with staff and students. They approached the situation cautiously, aware that the witnesses were children. Each child was spoken to individually rather than as a group. Officers avoided leading questions and allowed the children to describe the event in their own words. Notes were taken carefully, with emphasis on consistency rather than detail. The statements collected showed strong agreement on several points. The object was described as metallic, smooth, and silent. Its appearance was sudden, and its disappearance was equally abrupt. There was no report of noise before or after the sighting. The object did not behave like a known aircraft. These details appeared repeatedly across interviews. Police also inspected the area around the school. The playground, nearby fields, and surrounding land showed no physical disturbance. There were no marks on the ground, no damaged fencing, and no signs of recent mechanical activity. This absence of evidence neither supported nor contradicted the children's statements, but it was formally noted. Importantly, the police did not classify the incident as a hoax or prank. No indication was found that the children had coordinated their accounts. Teachers confirmed that the children had been separated before giving statements, reducing the possibility of shared storytelling. The calm demeanor of the witnesses was also recorded. As the report moved forward, it attracted attention beyond local authorities. News of the incident reached regional media, who contacted the school for confirmation. The school responded cautiously, confirming only that an unusual report had been made and that authorities were involved. No conclusions were offered. At the same time, information reached military channels. The Royal Air Force was notified of the report, following standard procedure for unexplained aerial observations. This step was administrative rather than reactive, but it marked an important transition in how the incident was treated. The involvement of the RAF did not imply validation of the sighting. It reflected protocol rather than belief. However, The decision to involve military authorities demonstrated that the report was being taken seriously enough to warrant official review. As the case moved beyond the school grounds, it remained unchanged in its basic facts. No new elements were added. No details were withdrawn. What had begun as a brief observation during a school break was now documented across multiple institutions, each recording the same core description. The story continued without explanation, guided only by the accounts already given. As information moved through official channels, the arrival of military interest added a new layer to the situation. Representatives connected to the Royal Air Force visited the area following standard procedures for unexplained aerial reports. Their role was not investigative in a criminal sense, but observational and administrative. The goal was to determine whether the sighting could be linked to known aircraft activity or military exercises. RAF personnel approached the case with caution. They were aware that the primary witnesses were children and that the incident had occurred during daylight hours. Each child was spoken to individually, separate from teachers and classmates. Questions were simple and direct, focusing on what was seen rather than how it was interpreted. No effort was made to suggest explanations or challenge the children's statements. During these interviews, the descriptions remained consistent with those already recorded by police. The object was described as silver in color, smooth in surface, and silent. No child described seeing rotors, wings, or propulsion systems. The reported shape did not align with conventional aircraft used by the RAF at the time. These observations were noted without conclusion. The reports of a humanoid figure were addressed carefully. RAF officers did not dismiss these accounts, but they also did not emphasize them. They recorded which children mentioned a figure and which did not. The lack of universal agreement on this detail was acknowledged, but it did not negate the shared description of the object itself. No radar data was publicly released in connection with the incident. It remains unclear whether radar records were reviewed or whether any anomalies were detected. Official statements did not confirm or deny radar involvement. This absence of information became part of the case record rather than a resolution. The visit by RAF personnel was brief. There was no extended presence, no containment measures, and no follow-up actions visible to the public. After gathering statements, the military representatives left the area. No explanation was provided to the school or to the families of the children involved. This lack of explanation did not indicate dismissal. Instead, it reflected the limits of what could be confirmed. Without physical evidence, radar confirmation, or adult eyewitnesses, the incident remained classified as unexplained rather than identified. As the military review concluded quietly, the school returned to its normal routine. Children resumed classes, and daily life continued. However, the presence of police and RAF officers left a lasting impression on the community. The incident was no longer a private school matter. It had entered official records without resolution. What remained was a documented event supported by multiple witnesses, reviewed by civilian and military authorities, and left without a public explanation. The story continued forward unchanged, shaped only by what had already been observed and recorded. As the incident spread through the village, parents began discussing what their children reported seeing. Conversations remained cautious, with no immediate assumptions. The presence of police and military visitors reinforced that the event had been recorded formally, even without explanation. Local media soon contacted the school and nearby residents. Reports focused on verified facts rather than speculation. Articles noted the number of child witnesses, the daytime setting, and the lack of noise, presenting the incident as unusual but unresolved cases. Headlines avoided dramatic language, reflecting uncertainty rather than conclusions. Journalists confirmed that authorities had been involved and that statements were taken properly. This careful framing prevented the story from becoming sensational, keeping attention on documented observations and official recorded details. Within the school, teachers monitored students for changes in behavior. None were observed. Children did not embellish accounts over time and did not repeat the story for attention. Their focus returned to lessons, reinforcing earlier impressions of sincerity and consistency. Investigators considered conventional explanations in sequence. Helicopters were evaluated and dismissed due to the absence of sound and rotor movement. Weather balloons were also considered, but did not match reported motion or proximity to the school grounds during daylight hours. Aircraft records were reviewed without identifying matching flights. No scheduled exercises were acknowledged publicly. This gap did not confirm extraordinary origins, but it prevented routine explanations from resolving the report conclusively at that time for local authorities and residents alike. Community discussion remained measured. Some residents expressed skepticism, while others emphasized the number of witnesses. The involvement of the RAF was frequently cited as a reason to avoid dismissing the event outright without complete information, evidence, confirmation, or conclusions publicly. Over the following days, no additional evidence emerged at the site. There were no photographs, marks, or debris. The case remained dependent on testimony, recorded carefully and preserved without modification by officials during initial reporting procedures and subsequent reviews periods. Attention then shifted beyond the village as regional interest grew. The incident joined a broader pattern of reports during the period, though each was evaluated separately and without assumption of connection to other events, locations, witnesses, timelines, causes, or explanations. At this stage, the record showed a simple sequence of events. Children observed an object, authorities documented reports, and no explanation followed. The narrative moved forward unchanged, carried only by consistent testimony and careful official handling without interpretation added later. As time passed, the incident settled into official records without resolution, but it did not disappear from discussion. Researchers who followed unexplained aerial reports began taking interest in the Broadhaven case because of its unusual characteristics. Daylight sightings involving multiple child witnesses were rare, and the involvement of police and military authorities made the report difficult to ignore. Investigators reviewing the case focused closely on the children's behavior before and after the sighting. Teachers and parents confirmed that the children had no prior discussion of UFOs or similar topics that could have influenced their descriptions. There was no evidence of rehearsal or shared storytelling. Each child had been questioned separately, and no contradictions emerged in the core details. The drawings produced by the children became an important part of the record. When asked to illustrate what they had seen, the children produced images that showed similar shapes and proportions. The object was consistently drawn as elongated, smooth, and featureless. Differences existed in size and angle, but the overall structure remained the same across multiple drawings. No effort was made by investigators to suggest details or guide the drawings. The children were given basic instructions and left to draw freely. This approach reduced concerns about influence or suggestion. Analysts later noted that the drawings lacked exaggerated features often associated with fantasy imagery. During follow-up interviews, the children did not add new details. They repeated the same descriptions they had given initially. This lack of expansion was considered significant. In fabricated stories, details often grow more complex over time. In this case, they remained simple and consistent. Attention was also given to the emotional state of the witnesses. None of the children showed signs of fear, trauma, or excitement beyond the day of the event. Their reactions appeared neutral, suggesting observation rather than interpretation. This emotional consistency supported earlier observations by teachers and police. At the same time, investigators remained cautious. Children's testimony, while valuable, required careful handling. No conclusions were drawn regarding the nature of the object. The case was classified as unexplained rather than identified or dismissed. The broader context was also considered. During the same period, other reports of unusual aerial activity were being logged in different parts of the United Kingdom. No direct connection was established, but the timing contributed to wider interest. Despite this attention, no new evidence emerged. The Broadhaven incident remained unchanged. It existed as a recorded observation supported by multiple witnesses, reviewed by authorities, and left without explanation. As the case continued forward, it carried only what had been documented from the beginning. There were no revisions, no confirmations, and no closure, only a careful record preserved as it stood. Discussion around the Broadhaven incident slowly moved beyond the village as researchers compiled records from across Wales. The case was included in broader reviews of unexplained sightings, not because of dramatic claims, but because of its documentation and witness handling. Analysts noted that few school-related reports involved formal police and military review during daylight hours. When the case was revisited, emphasis was placed on procedure, rather than interpretation. Investigators reviewed how statements were collected, how children were separated, and how questions were framed. This methodological focus helped preserve the original testimony without distortion. It also limited later reinterpretation, keeping the record stable. Skeptical explanations continued to be evaluated. Aircraft movements were reviewed again, including training flights and private aviation activity. Records did not align with the reported time and location. The absence of sound remained difficult to reconcile with helicopters or low-flying planes. Weather data was examined and showed no unusual atmospheric conditions that could produce visual distortions. Some critics suggested that the sighting could have involved a ground-based object or vehicle. This explanation was considered unlikely due to the object's reported hovering behavior and sudden disappearance. No vehicles were reported in nearby fields, and no tracks or disturbances were found. The presence of a reported humanoid figure remained controversial. Investigators acknowledged that only a portion of witnesses described this detail. Rather than emphasizing it, researchers treated it as secondary to the shared observation of the object. The core case rested on what the majority reported consistently. As years passed, the children involved grew older. When contacted as adults, several maintained that their memory of the event had not changed. They did not add new elements or reinterpret the experience. Their accounts remained aligned with what had been recorded initially. This long-term consistency drew attention from those studying memory reliability. While memory can change over time, the absence of embellishment suggested that the original impression remained intact. Researchers noted this without claiming it as proof. Despite ongoing interest, the case did not advance toward resolution. No new data emerged. No official explanation was issued. The Broadhaven incident continued to exist as a documented, unresolved observation, preserved by careful recording rather than dramatic interpretation. It remained part of official archives, referenced periodically by researchers, teachers, and journalists, not as evidence, but as an example of how unresolved events can persist without answers when documentation is careful and complete throughout. As the Broadhaven case remained unresolved, it became part of a growing archive of unexplained incidents reviewed periodically by civilian researchers. These reviews did not aim to prove extraordinary explanations. Their purpose was to understand how such events were recorded, preserved, and discussed over time. Broadhaven stood out because its documentation began immediately and remained unchanged. Researchers emphasized that the incident occurred in daylight, reducing the likelihood of misidentification caused by darkness. Visibility conditions were normal, and the location was familiar to the witnesses. The children were accustomed to the surrounding landscape and could easily distinguish between routine activity and something unfamiliar. Attention was also given to the absence of adult eyewitnesses. While this limited confirmation, it did not invalidate the reports. The lack of adult observation was explained by timing rather than dismissal. Teachers were indoors, and the sighting was brief. By the time adults were alerted, the object was no longer visible. Investigators noted that no attempt was made to create a narrative beyond what was observed. There were no claims of communication, interaction, or intent. The reports remained focused on appearance, position, and movement. This restraint contributed to the case's longevity, as it avoided speculation. Public interest fluctuated over the years. At times, the incident was referenced during broader discussions about unidentified aerial phenomena in the United Kingdom. At other times, it faded into archival records. Each time it resurfaced, the same facts were reviewed, and the same lack of explanation remained. The case also became relevant in discussions about how children's testimony is evaluated. Broadhaven was often cited as an example where children's accounts were neither dismissed nor sensationalized. Authorities treated the witnesses seriously while acknowledging limitations. No additional physical evidence was ever found. Searches of the area yielded nothing. This absence reinforced the neutral classification of the incident. It was not categorized as solved or hoaxed, only unexplained. Over time, official interest diminished, not because conclusions were reached, but because no further action was possible. The incident required no ongoing investigation without new information. What remained was a preserved record. Police notes, school reports, and media articles continued to exist without revision. Each retelling relied on these original documents rather than reinterpretation. The Broadhaven encounter did not evolve into myth or legend within official records. It remained fixed, defined by its initial documentation. This stability prevented distortion and maintained clarity. As the case continued forward, it occupied a specific place in the study of unexplained events. It demonstrated how careful handling can preserve information without forcing conclusions, allowing uncertainty to remain without exaggeration or dismissal. As years passed, the Broadhaven incident became a reference point rather than an active investigation. Researchers reviewing historical cases noted that its value lay in procedure, not explanation. The event showed how early documentation could preserve uncertainty without distortion. Because statements were taken immediately, later retellings relied on original records rather than memory alone. This approach limited the influence of later speculation. When the case appeared in academic and journalistic discussions, it was usually presented as unresolved. Authors avoided dramatic language and focused on verified steps taken by authorities. This consistency across publications reduced confusion and preserved context. The children's drawings were often reproduced alongside transcripts to illustrate agreement and shape. Analysts pointed out that differences in size or angle did not undermine the shared outline. These materials were treated as supplementary, not decisive. They supported testimony but did not replace the need for caution. Government departments were occasionally asked to comment but offered no additional information. Responses confirmed neither identification nor error. This neutral position maintained the case as open without implying significance. Within the community, the incident gradually became part of local history. Residents discussed it carefully, often emphasizing official involvement over interpretation. There was no effort to promote the event beyond what had been recorded. As attention shifted elsewhere, Broadhaven remained cited for its handling rather than its mystery. The case demonstrated that unresolved does not mean unreliable. It showed how restraint in reporting can protect accuracy over time. With no new evidence, the record stayed intact. Nothing was added, and nothing was removed. This stability allowed future reviews to begin from the same foundation. As a result, Broadhaven continued forward as a documented event without conclusion. Its place was defined by process, witness care, and the absence of resolution. The story remained unchanged, supported by records rather than belief. That condition allowed the account to persist quietly within official and research archives. It neither advanced nor closed, continuing only as it had begun. The narrative moved on without answers, guided solely by careful documentation. This approach ensured that uncertainty remained intact rather than reshaped. In this form, the Broadhaven incident continued to be referenced exactly as recorded. Nothing beyond the original observations was required to carry it forward. The case remained present without explanation, waiting without expectation. It stayed recorded, preserved, and unresolved within the historical record of Britain for decades there. As the Broadhaven incident remained unchanged, it continued to be examined within wider studies of unexplained aerial reports in the United Kingdom. Analysts reviewing multiple cases noted that Broadhaven differed in one key respect. The initial response was measured, and the record was preserved without pressure to resolve uncertainty. This approach allowed the case to exist without distortion. Researchers emphasized that no attempt was made to connect the sighting to extraterrestrial explanations. Official records avoided speculation entirely. The object was not described beyond its observed characteristics. Movement, shape, and silence were documented without interpretation. This restraint distinguished the case from others where early conclusions altered later understanding. The involvement of children remained central. Studies of eyewitness reliability frequently referenced Broadhaven when discussing how young witnesses should be handled. The separation of interviews, the avoidance of leading questions, and the absence of reward or attention reduced the likelihood of fabrication. These procedural elements were considered as important as the testimony itself. Over time, the case was included in archival reviews rather than active investigation. Without new evidence, there was no basis for reopening inquiries. The absence of resolution did not indicate failure. It reflected the limits of available information. Authorities acknowledged that some incidents could not be explained with existing data. Public interest resurfaced periodically, often during discussions of unidentified aerial phenomena reported elsewhere. Each resurgence followed the same pattern. Original records were revisited, and the same facts were presented. No additions were made. No reinterpretations replaced earlier documentation. The lack of official explanation remained consistent. Requests for clarification produced no new statements. This silence did not imply secrecy or confirmation. It indicated that no determination had been made. The case remained classified as unexplained rather than unknown. Broadhaven continued to serve as an example of how unresolved events can persist without escalation. It showed that careful documentation could preserve accuracy without forcing closure. The case neither expanded nor diminished over time. Its boundaries remained fixed. As new generations of researchers encountered the case, they approached it with the same limitations as those before them. Without evidence beyond testimony, analysis focused on process rather than outcome. The story moved forward without conclusion, sustained only by the integrity of its original record. In this state, the Broadhaven incident remained present but static. It existed within archives, referenced but not resolved. The narrative did not require answers to continue. It remained defined by observation, documentation, and restraint. As attention around the Broadhaven case continued quietly, it began appearing in official summaries of unexplained incidents reviewed by government departments. These summaries did not analyze individual cases in depth. They cataloged reports by date, location, and witness type. Broadhaven was listed without annotation, reflecting its unresolved status rather than significance. This method of record-keeping reinforced the neutral position held since the beginning. The case was neither elevated nor dismissed. It existed as one of many reports that could not be explained using available information. Its presence in official listings confirmed that it had not been forgotten, even though no further investigation was planned. Researchers reviewing these summaries observed that Broadhaven remained unchanged across decades. No amendments were made. No corrections appeared. The description stayed limited to what was recorded in 1977. This stability was unusual in cases that attracted public interest, where reinterpretation often altered original accounts. The lack of revision supported the conclusion that no new evidence had emerged. Authorities had nothing to add. Without physical traces, photographs, or corroborating adult sightings, the record remained closed to further development. This condition preserved accuracy while preventing speculation. At the same time, the case was referenced in discussions about institutional restraint. Analysts noted that officials resisted pressure to provide explanations when none were supported by evidence. This approach avoided false conclusions and maintained credibility. Broadhaven became an example of how uncertainty can be documented without escalation. Educational studies occasionally reference the incident when examining how institutions respond to reports involving children. The careful handling of testimony, the separation of witnesses, and the absence of suggestion were highlighted as effective practices. These procedural elements became the primary lesson of the case. Within the local community, memory of the incident softened over time. It was remembered as an unusual event rather than a defining moment. There were no commemorations or reenactments. The story remained factual and contained. Despite this quiet presence, Broadhaven continued to be cited in broader reviews of unexplained aerial phenomena. Its value lay not in what it proved, but in how it was handled. The incident demonstrated that some reports remain unresolved without becoming controversial. As years progressed, the case maintained its position without movement. It did not attract renewed investigation, nor did it fade entirely. It remained recorded, referenced, and unresolved, continuing forward exactly as documented. This status remained unchanged through decades. As broader attention slowly declined, the Broadhaven case remained preserved within archival systems rather than active inquiry. Researchers who later encountered the case did so through documentation rather than first-hand testimony. This separation ensured that analysis relied on original records instead of reinterpretation or memory influenced by time. The absence of photographs or physical traces continued to define the limits of investigation. While this restricted conclusions, it also prevented distortion. Nothing visual existed to be misread, enhanced, or altered. The case remained grounded entirely in recorded observation and procedural response. Analysts reviewing similar incidents noted that Broadhaven represented a rare balance between seriousness and restraint. Authorities acknowledged the report, documented it carefully, and then allowed it to stand without pressure to explain. This approach reduced the risk of error while preserving transparency. The role of the media during the initial period was revisited in later studies. Coverage had remained limited and factual, avoiding speculation. This restraint prevented the story from evolving beyond its documented boundaries. As a result, later researchers encountered the same information that existed at the time of the event. Educational researchers also examined the incident when studying how institutions respond to reports involving children. Broadhaven was cited as an example where testimony was neither dismissed nor sensationalized. This balanced handling contributed to long-term credibility. Over time, the case was occasionally referenced during parliamentary discussions about unidentified aerial reports. These references were brief and procedural, confirming that the report remained unresolved. No additional commentary accompanied these mentions, reinforcing the neutral stance maintained since 1977. Within the village, the event continued to exist quietly in memory. It was not used to promote tourism or local identity. Residents treated it as an unusual moment rather than a defining event. This local restraint mirrored official handling. The Broadhaven incident did not evolve into folklore within official records. Its preservation relied on documentation rather than repetition. Each review returned to the same notes, drawings, and summaries, unchanged. As the case moved further into history, its significance shifted. It became less about explanation and more about method. It demonstrated how careful handling allows uncertainty to remain intact without distortion. The narrative continued forward without resolution, carried by records rather than belief. It remained present, unchanged, and unresolved within the historical archive of unexplained incidents. As the Broadhaven case continued to be reviewed within historical studies, it became increasingly clear that its significance was not tied to discovery, but to preservation. Researchers examining long-term patterns of unexplained reports noted that many cases changed over time. Broadhaven did not. Its details remained fixed, supported by original records rather than later interpretation. This stability allowed the incident to be compared accurately with other reports from the same period. Analysts observed that few cases involving children maintained such consistency across decades. Where other accounts expanded or shifted, Broadhaven remained unchanged. This characteristic drew attention from those studying how narratives evolve under public interest. The case was often discussed alongside questions of credibility. Researchers avoided labeling the incident as proof or fabrication. Instead, they emphasized limits. Without physical evidence, conclusions could not be drawn. Without contradictions, dismissal could not be justified. The case existed within these boundaries. Attention was also given to how the children's testimony aged. When asked years later, some witnesses stated that their recollection matched what they had described originally. They did not attempt to reinterpret the event. They did not add meaning or explanation. Their memory remained observational. This lack of reinterpretation reduced the influence of hindsight. It suggested that the initial impression was strong enough to remain unchanged. Researchers noted this cautiously, acknowledging that memory reliability varies. No claim of certainty was made. The absence of institutional follow-up also became part of the analysis. Authorities did not reopen the case or reclassify it. This did not indicate suppression. It reflected the absence of new information. The case remained where it had been left. Broadhaven was occasionally included in documentaries examining historical UFO reports in the United Kingdom. These presentations relied on archival footage, drawings, and transcripts. Narration remained factual. No conclusions were imposed. The case was presented as unresolved. Public reaction to these documentaries remained measured. Interest centered on the procedural handling rather than the mystery itself. Viewers noted how calmly the incident was recorded and preserved. As time moved forward, the Broadhaven encounter remained defined by restraint. It demonstrated how unresolved events can persist without distortion when documentation is respected. The story continued exactly as recorded, neither expanding nor fading. It remained present within archives and studies, not because it demanded answers, but because it resisted alteration. The narrative moved forward unchanged, sustained by its original form and careful handling over time. As the Broadhaven case moved further into historical context, it began to be referenced less as an isolated incident and more as part of a broader pattern of unresolved observations. Researchers reviewing National Archives noted that Broadhaven shared characteristics with other reports, yet remained distinct due to the age of the witnesses and the setting in which it occurred. The school environment placed the event outside typical explanations. Children were not engaged in activities that encouraged imagination at the time of the sighting. The observation occurred during a routine break, in a familiar setting, under normal daylight conditions. These factors reduced the likelihood of misinterpretation caused by unusual circumstances. Analysts also considered the timing of the report. The incident occurred before widespread public discussion of unidentified aerial phenomena became common in popular media. This context reduced the possibility that the children's descriptions were influenced by external narratives. Their language remained simple and descriptive, focused on shape and movement rather than meaning. The lack of follow-up explanation continued to define the case. Government departments did not revise their position. No additional statements were released. This consistency reinforced the original classification of the incident as unexplained rather than misidentified. Broadhaven's inclusion in comparative studies highlighted the importance of early documentation. Cases where records were delayed or incomplete often developed inconsistencies. Broadhaven avoided this outcome due to immediate reporting and careful handling. The role of teachers and administrators was also examined. Their decision to report rather than dismiss the incident preserved its integrity. They did not attempt to explain what they could not observe. This restraint prevented later conflict between testimony and assumption. As discussions expanded, the case remained grounded. It was not used to support broader theories. Researchers resisted using Broadhaven as evidence for conclusions beyond its scope. This limitation protected accuracy. The incident's endurance within archives was attributed to this discipline. Without expansion, the case remained stable. Without resolution, it remained open. Broadhaven continued forward, not as a mystery seeking answers, but as a record demonstrating how uncertainty can exist without escalation. The narrative did not change direction. It simply remained, defined by what was observed, recorded, and left unexplained. Its continued presence within research literature showed that careful restraint, rather than speculation, allowed the account to remain useful for study, teaching, and reference without forcing conclusions where evidence did not exist or certainty today. As the Broadhaven incident continued to be referenced in research, attention shifted toward understanding why the case never moved beyond its original status. Analysts concluded that the absence of resolution was not due to neglect, but due to limitation. Without physical evidence, authorities had no mechanism to advance the case further. This limitation became central to later evaluations. Broadhaven demonstrated how some incidents reach a natural endpoint shortly after documentation. When observation is brief, witnesses are limited, and material evidence is absent, investigation reaches a boundary. Beyond that boundary, certainty cannot be achieved. Researchers emphasize that this boundary does not imply error. It reflects the structure of investigation itself. Systems designed to confirm events rely on measurable data. When such data does not exist, reports remain classified as unexplained. Broadhaven fit this condition precisely. The continued absence of official explanation reinforced this outcome. Government departments maintained the same position over time. No new information was added. No reinterpretation was offered. This consistency suggested closure without conclusion. The case also highlighted how restraint prevents escalation. Because officials avoided speculation, the incident did not transform into myth within institutional records. It remained factual and contained. This restraint preserved credibility. Comparative analysis showed that many unresolved cases lose clarity due to reinterpretation. Broadhaven avoided this pattern. Its stability was attributed to early documentation and the decision to preserve original testimony without modification. Educational discussions revisited the incident when examining how uncertainty is managed. Broadhaven served as an example where unanswered questions were accepted rather than forced into explanation. This approach prevented misclassification. Public curiosity remained limited but steady. When the case was mentioned, it was usually in context focused on process rather than mystery. This framing reduced sensational interest and encouraged analytical review. Over decades, the incident remained unchanged. Its documentation did not grow. Its meaning did not shift. It existed exactly as recorded, preserved by consistency and restraint. As time passed, the Broadhaven case illustrated a simple outcome. Some events remain unresolved not because answers are hidden, but because they cannot be reached. The narrative continued forward without alteration, defined by observation, documentation, and the limits of investigation. As the Broadhaven case continued to exist within archives, its role gradually shifted from an unresolved incident to a reference point for understanding investigative limits. Researchers no longer approached it seeking answers, but seeking insight into how uncertainty is preserved when evidence is incomplete. The case became a practical example rather than a question. This shift did not alter the facts. The original reports remained intact, unchanged by later interpretation. Police notes, school records, and media summaries continued to match one another. No contradictions appeared over time. This internal consistency allowed the case to remain usable for analysis without distortion. Attention turned toward institutional response. Analysts observed that authorities neither exaggerated nor minimized the report. They documented it, reviewed it, and then allowed it to stand. This approach avoided the risk of error that can occur when explanations are forced prematurely. Broadhaven demonstrated how restraint protects accuracy. By not assigning meaning beyond observation, officials preserved the event in its original form. This allowed later researchers to review the case without needing to filter out layers of speculation. The incident also influenced how future reports involving children were handled. Its procedural example encouraged careful separation of witnesses, neutral questioning, and minimal interpretation. These practices became standards referenced in training and review discussions. Despite its continued presence in research, Broadhaven did not generate new discussion about causes. It remained resistant to categorization. No theory fit without introducing unsupported assumptions. This resistance reinforced its classification as unexplained. The lack of development did not diminish the case's relevance. Instead, it clarified its purpose. Broadhaven showed that some events do not move toward resolution. They remain fixed at the point of observation. This condition highlighted a broader truth about investigation. Systems designed to explain rely on measurable input. When such input is absent, certainty cannot be produced. Broadhaven existed entirely within this limitation. As years passed, the case continued to be cited without change. It was not revisited for discovery, but for demonstration. Its endurance rested on its clarity, not its mystery. The narrative moved forward without conclusion. It did not require closure to remain valid. It remained present as a record of observation, careful handling, and unresolved outcome. In this form, Broadhaven continued to occupy its place within historical records. It remained unchanged, preserved by documentation rather than belief, and carried forward without explanation, exactly as it had been recorded decades earlier. As the Broadhaven incident approached its final position within research literature, analysts began framing it as a completed record rather than an open investigation. This did not imply resolution. It reflected acceptance that the case had reached the limits of what could be examined using available information. Nothing new was expected, and nothing further was required. The event continued to be cited when discussing how unresolved cases should be preserved. Broadhaven showed that allowing uncertainty to remain intact was preferable to introducing unsupported conclusions. This approach maintained credibility over time and prevented distortion. Researchers also noted that the case resisted polarization. It was not adopted strongly by proponents of extraordinary explanations, nor was it aggressively dismissed by skeptics. Its neutral handling limited its use as evidence for any position. This balance preserved the case as a reference rather than a tool. The witness's role remained central. Their testimony, recorded early and preserved without modification, continued to support the core observation. The absence of contradiction across decades reinforced confidence in documentation, even without physical proof. Educational materials occasionally reference Broadhaven when examining how narratives stabilize. The case illustrated that stories do not always evolve. Some remain fixed because there is no incentive or mechanism for change. Broadhaven fit this pattern precisely. The lack of institutional follow-up was not interpreted as avoidance. Analysts concluded that authorities had exhausted available options. Without new data, reopening the case would have produced speculation rather than clarity. The decision to leave it unchanged was considered appropriate. Public interest remained subdued. When mentioned, the incident was treated with caution. This restraint prevented the story from becoming exaggerated or misrepresented. Broadhaven remained defined by what was recorded, not by what was imagined. The case also demonstrated how documentation can outlast explanation. Decades later, the same notes, drawings, and summaries continued to represent the event accurately. This endurance validated the initial handling. As the incident settled into its final form, it no longer functioned as a question seeking answers. It functioned as an example of unresolved observation preserved through discipline. The narrative moved forward without conclusion, sustained by consistency and restraint. Broadhaven remained present within historical records, unchanged and unresolved, defined entirely by its original documentation and the careful decisions that followed it. Today, the Broadhaven School encounter remains exactly where it was left in 1977. It has not advanced toward explanation, nor has it been dismissed. The original records remain intact, unchanged by time or reinterpretation. What exists is a clear account of observation, response, and restraint. Children observed an object during daylight hours in a familiar environment. Their descriptions focused on shape, movement, and silence. Authorities documented these accounts carefully, separating witnesses and avoiding suggestion. Police and military representatives reviewed the report and found no explanation that could be confirmed using available information. The case was recorded and preserved. No physical evidence emerged. No photographs were taken. No adult eyewitnesses came forward. These limitations define the boundaries of investigation. Within those boundaries, the case reached its natural endpoint. Beyond them, certainty could not be produced. Broadhaven did not become a solved case, nor did it become a disputed one. It remained unresolved without conflict. This outcome reflected the discipline of those who handled it. Rather than forcing conclusions, officials allowed uncertainty to remain. Over time, the case gained relevance not because of what it proved, but because of how it was treated. It demonstrated that unresolved events can exist without distortion when documentation is prioritized over explanation. The original observations continued to stand on their own. Researchers revisiting the case decades later encountered the same information that existed at the beginning. No additions altered the narrative. No reinterpretations replaced recorded testimony. This stability preserved clarity. Broadhaven became an example of investigative limits. It showed that not all events move toward resolution. Some remain fixed at the moment of observation, defined by what can be recorded rather than what can be explained. The absence of answers did not diminish the value of the record. Instead, It reinforced the importance of accurate reporting and restraint. By avoiding speculation, the case remained useful for study without becoming misleading. Today, Broadhaven exists within historical archives as a complete account without conclusion. It does not demand belief. It does not offer proof. It simply remains. The narrative continues forward unchanged, not because it lacks meaning, but because meaning was never imposed. What happened at Broadhaven Primary School remains documented, reviewed, and unresolved, preserved exactly as it was recorded, without explanation, without alteration, and without closure.